Okay, so this is very much an oversimplification of the notion that I'm trying to present, because it doesn't really get into the fractal expression of this. But this was something I drew quite a while ago, and I'll just use it as sort of a basic, very, very basic generalization of what I'm sort of trying to talk about here. So there is sort of 7 systems in this, like the traditional, or the more modern chakra system, for example. And see, what I think integral theory is having trouble with is essentially what I'm now considering very subtle reductionalism. See, Ken Wilber has the notion of subtle reductionalism, wherein there's a reducing of what he considers the right-hand quadrants, which are sort of objectivity and interobjectivity, or more particularly, and this is part of the confusion itself, the gross world to the mental world, more or less, where in fact they tetrarise, and I'm totally in agreement with that. What I'm offering here, perhaps, is the very fact that there seems to be a confusion in integral theory with the right-hand quadrants. Namely, they seem to be doing sort of double time. They're both, I'd say, and he seems to be expressing the fact that they can represent both actually the objective thing in itself, and also the dimension perspective in a certain sense, or the actual event of recognizing the fact that we can be objective observers, where in fact I'm kind of suggesting that they're distinct things. And when we break that apart, then we can parallel it with the old school chakra system in a certain sense. So what I'm suggesting, therefore, and I have to use different language to express it, is we take the objective reality, which goes all the way up. It's not metaphysical in the sort of more or less pre-modern systems, which is a big distinction here with the old chakras. In the old chakra system, everything from here, in a certain sense, is metaphysical. After the bottom, this is the physical, and then everything above it is sort of metaphysical. Wherein this is a fractal that the physical is re-expressing itself in higher order complexities all the way up. So the fractal is this, although representing primarily the physical, has a what I consider second tier physical expression, or vital expression, and then it has a impulsive expression, an emotional expression, what I'm calling now a cognitive expression, which is the ability to objectify, and an intercognitive expression, and then maybe something beyond it, which is just in the developmental beginnings. So, in other words, it seems like the very nature of the 7 chakra system was a peeking into of, because you get a beginning sense of the higher system. So from the system that you're at. So I would say that they were in second tier awareness to some extent when they came up with the 7 stage chakra system, but they were operating within a pre-modern culture. So it comes with all the baggage of that. So when we look at something like this, we have essentially, when we parallel it with integral theory, I would say that this is objective, but it's not a self-recognized objectivity. It's not that the observer recognizes its objectivity. In fact, there is such it's absolutely narcissistic. It's a totally one dimension perspective when it's just that, when it's just atoms, when it's just molecules. You know, there's no real interiority, but there's a fractal expression of it that goes all the way up. So it's hard to explain, but I think in the sort of what I said before, the Hawking's sort of sense, the higher dimensions to the perspective of the atom in a certain way are bound up. They're curled up on themselves, so that perspective cannot see any of the perspectives that's above it. So when I say objectivity, the objective perspective, dimension perspective, I mean that in the sense that it is bound up in and as a sort of object unidimensionally. There's no distinction within itself of the other perspectives, but we can, as a higher order dimension perspective thinker, separate it so that you can show the different dimension perspectives of the unidimensional thing. So it gets a little bit convoluted because it itself isn't expressing itself that way. But we can break it up so that we can do more things in a certain way with that that ground matter. So the second dimension perspective is largely to do with vital life. So I have here a little plant, and that would be the end sort of result of that dimension perspective, because it's interobjective in that it's using the objective matter and organizing itself to code itself. So genetics start to really come online here, and maybe, you know, at the higher end of it we get meiosis and mitosis and, you know, early reproductive processes, but there's no real self-organized I sense, I don't think, at this point. There's quorum sensing and that sort of thing, but no, and maybe a primitive libido as you get up to the higher levels of the second tier. And again, it has a coding of the first tier within it, and it's expressing a little bit of the third tier, because in developmental theory there's the notion that there's about 25% expression of the higher tier bound up with the lower tier or stage, and I'm suggesting the same thing is happening with the tiers too. So it's 50% organized here, 25% organized here, 25% organized here, but it always has to pull from the tiers below to transcend and include it to work. And then when you get into the third tier, it's now, because it has some sort of regulated I sense, it's bound in time, so it has actually a temporal perspective that's only in the now. So you start to see it with fish, and it goes into, I put a little, essentially a little insect, which would probably be in the lower part of it, but, you know, it's starting to get a sense of its I, that it's operating as an organism for itself, and has this kind of predatory quality to it. So this takes on the vital tier in that it, you know, it needs health to survive, as do all the other higher order tiers. But its focus is different now. Its focus is on really fighting for itself, whereas, you know, lower second tier stuff seems to be connecting up with itself to organize, to make a bigger material structure. My distinction here isn't super strong, but I think that there is indeed a tier jump when you get into, you know, approximately insects and then up into reptiles and that sort of thing. And then with mammals, we're getting into emotive care. That is to say, they seem to have emotional bonding capacities, and I believe that connects with their capacity not only to be in the waking state, but also the dreaming state, where they can reorganize their thoughts to respond differently from, you know, say fish or other more primarily genetically driven beings like I mentioned in the last video, sort of salmon always return back to where they were, but it's not because they have memory, it's because that's sort of the genetic coding, so it's really running on this more interobjective space, although it is in this early subjective space. It has some memory, but not very much. Whereas when you get into this, the memory is far more operational. They've adapted. The cat's jumped up to a particular location hundreds of times, so it knows how to do that and adapt to the changes that it's really run into. The fluidity of these earlier tiers don't really require much adaptation, in other words, so the focus can move from more or less surviving, which it still has to do, it's still transcendent, include that, but now it can focus more on tribal or kinship bonding within a small group. And then this is what I'm considering the human tier, but humans, see, the individual human, it is a spiral dynamics, and I'm connecting this fractally. This would be beige within that, so this is 5.1, so that's beige. 5.2 is purple. See, it has this kind of kinship bonding for safety purposes in purple, and it's not quite self-aware of its own individuality with purple. It has fleeting glimpses of it. So this makes more sense than what I was talking about earlier. And then with 5.3, we get sort of the power gods, so red starts to come online. It actually has a true sense of, multiplistic doesn't quite, these ones I'd have to reorganize. I kind of got that wrong. So, but I would put this as egocentric here, 5.3 egocentric, and that's connected to more or less, sort of power issues. And then 5.4 would be essentially a blue, where we see the major religious traditions coming online, the sense of something higher, a higher purpose, and that's the connecting within the heart. And we see, interestingly, the shamanic traditions are down here, and then you get some early subtle stuff, and then you get really the true mystic saints coming on with blue, so you can connect this to states of consciousness as I was doing before. So we move through those states that were previously developed too, and then with this we get the causal state, because it's the individual is systemically understanding its own individuality, and so it's more or less witnessing of your own causal capacities come online here in the states, and we can see that historically. And then with this we get the non-dual traditions, but in the flatland mode, because it's 5.6, and so this is also when green came online culturally, and there would be the predecessors of that historically, reaching back almost 2,000 years. There was early reflections of non-dualism with Plotinus and these sorts of people. And so how this connects then to integral theory again, we have objectivity, interobjectivity, subjectivity, intersubjectivity, cognition, intercognition, and so those the right-hand quadrants then are, as I said, sort of pulling double time in my opinion. So I break it up and say that the right-hand quadrants need to also be expressed. The words objectivity and interobjectivity, as I said, aren't reflecting the fact that the dimension perspective is witnessing its objectivity. Rather, it's bound up with its own objectivity. So the science perspective is therefore up here, and the interscience perspective is up here, focused on different things than, because now this one can actually witness its objectivity, but objectivity in all these different domains. At the end of this, that is 5.6, we see the attempt at objectifying evolution, and that's from a flatland perspective, it's from a 5 perspective, whereas when we get into 6, then 6 is actually looking at evolution, because it's intercognitive, from a more full ground. That's the whole focus in a certain way, is to interconnect, but cognitively how it all works. So it's non-dual in a real sense, if you will.